I ran across a video the other day, and it proposed an idea that I knew was somewhat true, and yet I was nonetheless surprised to see. Men don't read anymore. An article by Today reported that only 73% of men had read a book in the last year, and that only 33% were likely to read any fiction.
Some men like fiction.
Yeah, the gods of God.
David Morris wrote an op-ed in the Times, and he said that even further, 60% of the applicants to his writing program that he worked at were women, and that the young male novelist was a, quote, rare species. So if it's true that men aren't reading or writing fiction anymore, what does that mean, and why is it bad? I think, for starters, you could argue that men just don't come across stories that arrest their imagination as much or enough. You know, it might seem silly now, but when I was a kid, I remember reading a series of books called Redwall by a guy named Brian Jakes. I remember reading his author bio on the back cover. It said, Jakes has at times been a sailor, a truck driver, longshoreman, comedian, folk singer, radio host, and each of these pursuits have colored his rich tapestry of stories. When I was a kid and reading these stories in my bedroom, he seemed like a man's man, a guy who had been everywhere and done everything. And even though I didn't know him, would never know him, and he lived across the ocean from me, he was a guy that I wanted to emulate, somebody I wanted to meet even, to shake his hand and see how firm his grip was. He wrote stories about, albeit animals, but talking animals that resembled things that you'll find in the human experience. He wrote stories about characters that have to conjure courage in the face of obstacles, friendship, and a lot of food. The stories were fanciful, and yet there was a soul in them that you can find anywhere in the human experience. And it kept me coming back for more. The life cycle of reading as a man might look something like this. You read books as a kid, and then you go to high school and college where the assigned reading gets really difficult, and it gets drab and boring. And then in your 20s, you either come back to reading with a new lens to look through, or you don't. And usually that book that brings you back into reading is you're reading something for pleasure. It's a Brandon Sanderson or something like that. Maybe a friend recommends a book and you just pick it up on a whim and start reading. But there's always something about that book that if you do come back to reading, it's got a similar quality across the board. It's a book that for whatever reason is somehow arresting. The issue is that in this life cycle where you either come back to reading or you don't, there's several obstacles for why you might not ever come back to reading at all. The number one obstacle is probably social media or bro culture on social media. In 2024, you're offered everything in the way of entertainment that you could want on YouTube or TikTok. These are apps that are made to retain your attention, whittle away what precious time you do have, and not to mention some influencers on these apps like Andrew Tate might insist that reading is not macho enough or doesn't satisfy his need for chaos in his life.
I'm too smart to read.
I think the issue here is that if you're offered easy, endless entertainment, you're naturally going to default to what is easy, scrolling. Whereas reading is a really poor alternative. It's slow, it's boring. It doesn't satisfy that dopamine kick that you'll get out of scrolling on your phone. And you're starting to find that even in schools, they're taking smartphones away because this relationship between smartphones and concentration is one that the smartphone, it's always going to win. Another of these outcomes might be that, yeah, you got back into books in your 20s, but you're not reading books for pleasure and you're trying to chase a certain outcome. And maybe you don't achieve that outcome and then the purpose of reading for you just seems pointless. Some of those outcomes might look like how to scale my business, how to earn an extra $50,000 a year, how to lose 10 pounds in 3 months, or maybe even how to win friends and influence people. But I would argue a key element of this is not reading to chase an outcome. Yes, outcomes are great. As a man, you want to provide for your family. You want to be a contributor to society. You want to make your life better. But I would argue that reading for pleasure will perhaps help you achieve some of those goals that you didn't even know you were trying to achieve, probably make you a little bit more intelligent, And I think there's something to be said for enjoying an activity that doesn't have a specific end goal in mind. I think we have lost the plot on finding adventure in story. We're looking at these self-help books to better our business or help us earn more money. We're sold on the idea that reading is the cheat code to that specific fill-in-the-blank outcome, to being a better man, earning more money, growing a business. But I think that reading shouldn't be specifically about an outcome. It should be about the journey. If you lose that journey or don't care about it, your reading becomes somewhat transactional, hollow. It loses that wonder that you felt as a kid. This study by Witten, Labby, and Sullivan at Sam Houston State found that high school students who read for pleasure perform better in math, science, history, and English subjects in school, concluding that, quote, educators agreed that reading for pleasure was beneficial, even essential to student development and achievement. So it leaves us with a lingering question. What if reading for pleasure might help you with your desired outcomes anyway? If you go look at recommended books for guys online, you'll see a lot of the usual suspects. The Count of Monte Cristo, Walden, The Sun Also Rises, The Brothers Karamazov, The Call of the Wild, Slaughterhouse-Five, and others. The issue with these recommendations is that these books require a lot of you as a reader. They're classics, and they're worthy of a lot of the praise that they get, but they're tough books. And when you're trying to read for the journey, not necessarily for the outcome, you're potentially going to start with some of these books that require a lot of you as a reader, which brings us to our other issue with reading and perhaps why you don't get back into it. It's that reading is like a muscle. You can't start ego lifting before you've built a solid base. And I think that whether they realize it or not, a lot of men fall into this trap where they're ego lifting their reading and they are quote unquote injuring themselves. And I think this final issue is perhaps about just not knowing where to start. I think when you're first trying to get back into reading and you're trying to read for pleasure, obviously the number one goal here is to find pleasure in it. And if you're not doing that, you're probably doing something wrong. So where should you start if you want to read for pleasure again? Maybe capture some of that joy and imagination you had as a kid. Here are a few options. I tend to tell people a lot of times, if you're wanting to get back into reading, a really easy way to do it is to read a thriller like Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. This book is super fun. It's about the road not taken and how choices made in your past can affect your future and the regret that sometimes you might have about those choices. This book is very easy to read and it's really fun and potentially will blow your mind in the process. You could also go the Bernard Cornwell route and read sharp books, which I think are essential guy reading if you want to hop back into reading for fun. These things are adventurous. You'll get a lot of history in the process, so maybe you'll learn a thing or two about the Napoleonic era. And you're just going to have a lot of fun with a roguish character in Richard Sharp who goes on wild adventures in the army, and it's some of your classic adventure tropes wrapped up in this really awesome and long adventure series. I also really love Jean Le Carré, and this one here, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, is just an awesome classic mystery spy thriller. Jean Le Carré is kind of the founder of the spy genre, or one of them anyway. And this book blew my mind in the final 3 pages. It was one of those reading experiences where you sort of put the book down, you sit back and you go, oh, wow, I didn't see that coming. And then maybe if you want to get into some fantasy, try The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. It's really great characters. It's witty. It's a journey like what you might see in some other fantasy books, but with a certain twist. It's a really, really awesome book and one of the best places to start if you want to get into the fantasy genre. So I've got a simple challenge for you to hopefully help you get back into reading if you're not there yet. Give yourself a half an hour where you put away your phone and you sit down with a book. Not a transactional book, not a book that is going to get you a desired outcome, but a book meant to be read for pleasure. Try reading for that half hour with little or no expectations. It's probably going to be difficult. You might find yourself distracted, struggling to maintain your focus on the page, and that's okay. Give yourself that half hour and then do the same thing the next day. Carve out a half hour where you can just sit and read. And if you're bored at first, that's fine. Just allow yourself to be bored reading the pages. And then if you do that twice, 3 times, 4 times, you're going to find that either because the book is really resting and you're super interested in it, or because that muscle, that reading muscle starts to get developed, you're going to find that it's a little bit easier to sit and read a book. And hopefully if you sit and do that enough, you're going to find that you actually do enjoy reading.